What does it mean for a people to disappear? Not always to die, not always to be defeated in some final blaze of ruin. Sometimes a civilization vanishes more quietly than that. The cities remain, the roads are still visible from the air. Stone walls hold their shape against the weather. A harbor still curves around the sea. A script survives on broken tablets, on tomb walls, on fragments of clay. And yet the people who gave those things meaning begin to fade. First from power, then from language, then from memory itself. History often teaches us to look for endings in fire. We imagine toppled gates, shattered armies, smoke rising above a conquered capital. But many of the ancient world's most haunting disappearances did not happen that way. They unfolded through trade, migration, imitation, conquest without spectacle, absorption without witness. A stronger empire arrived. A new language entered the marketplace. Old gods were renamed. Local rulers became provincial administrators. Children inherited the land, but not always the story. Across the Mediterranean, across Anatolia, across the deserts of Arabia and the river plains of South Asia, entire societies once shaped the world around them. They built ports and palaces, towers and tombs, irrigation systems and sacred spaces. They traded across great distances. They mastered stone, bronze, water, wind. Then contact came with larger, more centralized powers, and something essential began to slip away. This is not only a story about collapse, it is a story about erasure, about how identity can be worn down without a single final battle, about how a people can survive in blood, in soil, even in architecture, and still be lost. And so we begin where history becomes most unsettling, not with ruins, but with silence. What kind of people arrive with their children, their carts, and their whole lives behind them? Invaders do not usually travel that way. Refugees do. Settlers do. Civilizations in motion do. In the final decades of the Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean trembled as if some hidden structure beneath it had begun to crack. Kingdoms that had traded with one another for centuries suddenly faltered. Palace economies weakened. Supply lines for bronze frayed. Harvest became less certain. In that atmosphere of strain, Egyptian scribes carved a warning into stone. Strange coalitions were approaching by land and sea, carrying not only weapons, but families. The Egyptians named them collectively as the Sea Peoples. The images left behind are vivid enough to feel immediate even now. Ships collide in narrow waters, archers crowd the decks, bodies fall into the current. On land, ox carts roll forward under the weight of households uprooted from somewhere else. It is one of history's most dramatic entrances. Yet what makes the Sea Peoples unforgettable is not simply their arrival. It is the fact that after shaking the foundations of the ancient world, they seem to dissolve. From Anatolia to the Levant, archaeologists have traced destruction layers to the same unsettled window in time. Cities burned. Trade routes failed. The old order, once interconnected and surprisingly fragile, came apart with astonishing speed. And still, the people blamed for this collapse left behind no clear homeland, no archive in their own voice, no capital city that scholars can point to and say, here, this was theirs. Maybe that is the wrong question. Maybe they were never one people. Maybe they were fragments of many broken worlds, pushed together by famine, climate stress, war, or the failure of states that had once held the region in balance. If so, then the Sea Peoples were not merely destroyers. They were also evidence that something larger had already begun to fail. And that possibility lingers. When a civilization appears suddenly out of the fog, are we seeing an enemy arrive, or the human face of collapse itself? What does a civilization sound like when its voice can no longer be translated? Perhaps like surf against stone. Perhaps like footsteps in a palace corridor after the ceremony has ended. On Crete, the silence feels almost deliberate. Long before classical Greece imagined heroes and labyrinths, the island held another world entirely. The Minoans built palaces that seemed less like fortresses than living organisms. Open, layered, colorful, filled with light wells, storage chambers, workshops, shrines, and painted walls where dolphins moved through blue space as if the sea itself had entered the architecture. Their ships carried goods and ideas across the Mediterranean. Their art suggested elegance, ritual, motion. Their confidence was so complete that many of their great centers rose without massive defensive walls. Then the rhythm changed. A volcanic eruption on Thera shattered the sky and sent shockwaves across the region. Yet the Minoan world did not end in that single moment. It recovered. Buildings were repaired. Trade continued. The deeper unraveling came later, quieter and harder to name. By the 15th century BCE, key palace centers were destroyed or abandoned. New administrative habits appeared. A different script, Linear B, arrived from mainland Greece. Artistic styles stiffened. Power no longer looked fluid and maritime. It looked harder, more martial, more controlled. What vanished was not the population of Crete, but the autonomy of the culture that had once defined it. The people remained, but the language encoded in Linear A never followed them into the future. It stopped, undeciphered, like a door sealed from the inside. Their myths may have survived in altered form, folded into later Greek stories of kings and monsters, but legend is a poor substitute for a people speaking in their own words. That is the deeper loss. Not simply that a society declines, but that it gets remembered through someone else's imagination. When one civilization absorbs another, what survives first is often the image, not the meaning. And how many worlds do we think we know only because their true voice was replaced by myth? How does a people disappear while the land still speaks their name? In ancient Anatolia, that is exactly what seems to have happened. Before the Hittite Empire rose into history with its treaties, armies, and royal archives, central Anatolia was known as the land of Hatti. The name came from the people already there, a culture rooted in the plateau long before Indo-European rulers took control. They built settlements, maintained sacred places, and shaped the spiritual geography of the region. Then a new power arrived, not as a passing raid, but as a system strong enough to inherit the land and reorganize it. What followed was not the kind of ending history usually dramatizes. There is little sign of a sweeping extermination. Many settlements continued. Religious centers remained active. The land was not emptied. It was repurposed. Hittite rulers adopted local deities, preserved certain rituals, and continued to call the territory Hatti, as though the old name itself carried authority they wished to possess. And yet the people behind that name begin to recede almost immediately. Their language survives only in fragments, embedded in later ritual texts like echoes trapped inside another civilization's memory. It was neither Semitic nor Indo-European, and it never reaches us in a full archive of its own. No great body of native writing remains to explain how the Hattians saw the world, how they understood kingship, prayer, kinship, or time. They are visible only through the careful records of those who replace them. That kind of disappearance is especially haunting. It suggests not just conquest, but transfer. Their gods were retained, their sacred geography mattered. Their cultural prestige was useful enough to borrow, but their independent voice was not carried forward with equal care. The conquerors kept the shell of memory and let the speaker vanish. So the question lingers over Anatolia like weather over old stone. When a civilization preserves your temples, your place names, even parts of your religion, but not your language, have you survived at all? Or have you simply become the foundation beneath someone else's history? Can a name be conquered before a people are gone? Along the southern coast of the Levant, that question hangs over the ruins like heat over stone. For centuries, the Philistines stood at the edge of empire and refused to be invisible. Their cities, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, formed a chain of power between inland kingdoms and the Mediterranean world. They were traders, metal workers, builders, and political rivals. Their pottery carried echoes of the Aegean. Their foodways shifted from those of their neighbors. Their ports opened toward a wider sea. Whatever their origins, they became something distinct on that coastline. And yet almost everything we know about them arrives through the voices of others. Egyptian inscriptions name them as adversaries. Biblical texts cast them as enemies. Assyrian and Babylonian records treat them as subjects, tributaries, obstacles in the path of imperial order. Their own voice survives only in fragments. A few inscriptions, a few material traces, enough to prove presence, not enough to secure narrative control. Then Babylon moved west. In the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, imperial campaigns tore through the Levantine corridor, crushing resistance and redrawing political life. Some Philistine cities were violently damaged. Storehouses burned, walls collapsed. But the deeper transformation came afterward. The cities did not vanish into emptiness. They were repopulated, reorganized, absorbed into a provincial framework larger than themselves. Trade resumed, administration continued, life went on. Only the name began to thin out. That is what makes their disappearance so unsettling. Not total destruction, but administrative flattening. Over time, Philistine identity ceases to appear as a meaningful political category in the records of empire. Their cities remain, but under other systems. Their population continues, but increasingly blended into the surrounding world. Their distinctiveness softens until history stops calling them by the old name at all. Perhaps that is one of empire's quietest powers, not just to conquer territory, but to rename reality until a people survives only as an echo in the language of its rivals. And once the name is gone, how long before the memory follows it? What happens when a kingdom is not shattered, but absorbed so gently that history barely records the moment? In the desert city of Petra, the answer is carved into stone. The Nabataeans built beauty where almost nothing should have survived. In a landscape of heat, rock, and limited rain, they engineered channels, cisterns, and reservoirs with astonishing precision. They turned scarcity into design. Caravan routes carrying incense, spices, textiles, and precious goods passed through their hands, linking Arabia to the Mediterranean. Petra rose from that trade not just as a refuge, but as a statement. Wealth could be cut directly into the mountains. Their facades still seemed theatrical, almost impossible, glowing red and gold as daylight shifts across the canyon walls. But the real genius of the Nabataean world was less visible. It lived in logistics, in water management, in diplomacy, in the patient control of movement through the desert. They were not marginal people living beyond empire. They were a kingdom positioned between empires, skilled enough to remain indispensable. Then Rome expanded east. When the empire annexed Nabataea in the 2nd century CE, there was no legendary final siege, no immortal battle scene passed down through poetry. The transition appears strangely procedural. A province was created, new officials arrived, coins changed, inscriptions shifted. Roman order settled over the trade routes like a net. Petra did not die in a single blow. It continued at first under a larger imperial frame, but continuity can be deceptive. Over time, the old markers of Nabataean sovereignty began to thin. Their language receded from public life. Their gods were blended into wider religious systems. Their trade advantage weakened as Rome redirected commerce along its own infrastructure. The city remained magnificent, yet its distinct political identity grew fainter with each generation. Integration brought stability, but it also dissolved the conditions that had once made Nabataea unmistakably itself. This is the paradox Petra leaves behind. The monuments endure almost too well. They make the civilization seem permanent. Yet the people who imagined, organized, and named that world were gradually folded into something larger until their separate voice became difficult to trace. And one cannot help but wonder, when a culture's greatest works survive but its identity does not, what exactly have the stones managed to preserve? Why would a civilization build thousands of towers and then leave them standing behind? On Sardinia, that question rises from the landscape itself. Across the island, stone towers known as nuraghi still dominate ridges, valleys, and open ground. Some are solitary. Others belong to sprawling complexes surrounded by villages, meeting spaces, and sacred wells. Built from enormous blocks without mortar, they seem both practical and symbolic, as if they were designed to watch, to gather, and to endure. Even now, they give the impression of a society that once knew exactly how to organize labor, territory, and belief. The people who built them were not hidden from the world. Bronze figurines, seafaring imagery, metalwork, and imported goods reveal a culture tied to the wider Mediterranean. Sardinia was rich in resources and strategically placed, which meant attention from abroad was inevitable. Phoenician traders established coastal settlements. Later came Carthaginian power, then Roman authority. None of these contacts arrived all at once like a storm. They came in layers, through exchange, influence, dependency, and eventually control. And that is what makes the Nuragic story so difficult to pin down. There is no single apocalyptic ending, no island-wide burn layer, no final battlefield that explains the silence. The towers were not systematically destroyed. Many were simply abandoned, left in place as the world around them changed. Coastal life became more entangled with foreign trade networks. New political centers emerged. Old inland systems lost some of their gravitational pull. The people of Sardinia remained. Their bloodlines continued. But the social order that once revolved around the Nuragi lost coherence. Ritual patterns faded. Elite bronze production declined. Villages reorganized under different structures of power. The towers stayed where they were, but the culture that made them meaningful no longer held the island in the same way. There is something especially haunting about ruins that were not ruined. They suggest not a dramatic ending, but a slow withdrawal of purpose, as if a society did not fall so much as drift beyond recognition. And maybe that is the deeper mystery of Sardinia. Not why the stones survived, but why the world that gathered around them did not. What becomes of a civilization when it is not destroyed by empire, but invited into its center? In ancient Elam, the answer is as unsettling as any battlefield ruin. For more than 1,000 years, Elam stood east of Mesopotamia as a rival, a partner, a persistent presence. Its rulers governed from cities like Susa. Its scribes used a language unlike those of its powerful neighbors. Its kings fought wars, signed alliances, built temples, and managed a political world sophisticated enough to endure repeated cycles of conflict. Elam was not a minor frontier culture. It was one of the old names of the ancient Near East. There were moments of terrible violence. Assyrian campaigns struck with theatrical brutality, and royal inscriptions celebrated the devastation of Elamite cities as if destruction itself were a form of political art. Temples were looted. Tombs were opened. Statues were carried away. Yet even this did not end Elam. The society recovered, at least in part. Power shifted, but the civilization persisted. Then came Persia. Under the Achaemenid Empire, Susa did not become a forgotten ruin. It became something stranger, an imperial capital. The city was restored, elevated, woven directly into the machinery of a new superpower. Elamite scribes continued to work in administration. The Elamite language remained useful at high levels of government. On the surface, this could look like survival. A people once threatened by conquest now occupied the center of empire. But proximity to power can also dissolve boundaries. Over time, Elam ceased to appear as a distinct political identity. Its language, once active in governance, fell quiet. Its traditions were folded into a wider imperial order that had room for local function, but less and less room for separate historical selfhood. The population continued. The region remained inhabited. The capital flourished. Yet the civilization called Elam slowly disappeared into the success of something larger than itself. That is the paradox. Some cultures are erased by fire. Others are absorbed by admiration, utility, and administrative inclusion. Elam was not simply crushed. It was incorporated so thoroughly that its old identity became difficult to separate from the empire that inherited it. And perhaps that is one of history's hardest truths. Sometimes a people vanish not when their cities fall, but when their cities become indispensable to someone else's future. What does a vanished city look like in the desert? Not always broken, not always burned. Sometimes it looks preserved, geometric, waiting, as if its people stepped away only yesterday. In the sands of Central Asia, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a civilization that should have been far better known. Fortified compounds rose from the earth in sharp lines. Monumental walls enclosed courtyards, halls, storage spaces, and ritual areas. Seals, crafted vessels, and traces of long-distance exchange linked these settlements to worlds far beyond the oasis. This was the Oxus civilization, an urban culture thriving between great spheres of influence: Mesopotamia to the west, the Indus world to the south, and the moving societies of the steppe beyond. It occupied an unlikely place for permanence. These were settlements sustained by careful management of water, agriculture, and trade in a hard landscape. Their architecture suggests planning, authority, and a confidence in continuity. People do not build like that unless they expect the future to remain in some recognizable form. And yet the future changed. What followed was not a single disaster visible in ash. Many Oxus sites show no decisive evidence of violent annihilation. Walls stand without the scars of final siege. Occupation seems to thin rather than snap. Some spaces were repurposed, others were abandoned to wind and time. Around them, larger regional patterns were shifting. Trade systems became less stable. Climate pressures may have narrowed the margin for life in fragile oasis zones. New populations moved through the wider region, bringing different lifeways, burial customs, and perhaps different ideas of settlement itself. The most haunting fact is that the civilization left no clear written testimony that we can read as its own. We see its order, but not its explanation. We see the architecture, but not the thoughts that justified it. And so its disappearance feels especially quiet, not because nothing happened, but because the inner record is missing. A city can survive long enough to be excavated and still fail to tell us why it emptied. That is the lesson of the Oxus world. Its walls endured, its coherence did not. And perhaps every abandoned place asks the same difficult question. When the structure remains but the meaning is gone, what exactly have we found? How do you vanish beneath the shadow of a civilization you helped create? In ancient Italy, the Etruscans offer one of history's most intimate answers. Before Rome became Rome in the way the world remembers it, Etruscan cities were already shaping the peninsula. They built with ambition. They engineered drainage systems, organized urban space, worked metal with remarkable sophistication, and filled tombs with painted scenes of music, feasting, dancing, and ceremony. Their world was refined, wealthy, and deeply connected to the wider Mediterranean. Greek goods reached their cities. Their own influence reached far beyond them. For a time, they did not stand at the margins of history. They stood near its center. What makes their stories so moving is how much of them seems to survive in Rome itself. Religious rites, symbols of authority, architectural knowledge, even parts of public spectacle bear Etruscan fingerprints. Roman power did not emerge from a vacuum. It grew in a landscape the Etruscans had already shaped, absorbing methods as readily as territory. In that sense, the Etruscans were not merely Rome's neighbors. They were among its teachers. And yet teachers are often forgotten once the student becomes an empire. The Roman expansion into Etruscan lands unfolded over generations. Some cities resisted militarily. Others were gradually drawn into alliances, dependencies, and administrative incorporation. This was not a single cataclysm with one final day to remember. It was a long transfer of gravity. Latin entered public life. Roman offices replaced local authority. Etruscan elites adapted, intermarried, and found places within the machinery of the rising republic. The people remained, but their separate political world narrowed until it no longer stood on its own. Their language lingers like a locked door. Thousands of inscriptions survive, and scholars can sound out many of the letters, yet the deeper structure remains only partly understood. We can see the shape of the voice without fully hearing it. By the 1st century BCE, it had largely ceased to live as a spoken public language. That may be the most human kind of disappearance, not being erased all at once, but being inherited so completely that your legacy survives more visibly than your name. Rome endured and expanded. The Etruscans remained underneath it, like foundations hidden beneath a city still growing toward the sky. What happens to a civilization when its people continue, but its way of organizing the world does not? Along the old river systems of the Indus Valley, that question lingers in brick, dust, and empty streets. The cities themselves still feel startlingly modern. Gridded avenues, standardized bricks, covered drains, wells placed with practical intelligence, settlements separated by great distance, yet built according to shared proportions, shared measures, shared assumptions about order. This was not accidental growth. It was coordination on a civilizational scale. It suggests a world where trust, planning, and repeated patterns connected strangers across hundreds of miles. And then that pattern loosened. By around 1900 BCE, many urban centers of the Indus world began to thin out. The change is visible not only in the great cities, but in the smaller settlements that fed, linked, and stabilized the larger system. Houses were divided into tighter spaces. Building standards became less consistent. Long-distance trade markers grew scarce. Administrative seals, once part of a broader network of exchange and identity, appeared less often. The infrastructure remained impressive, but the coherence behind it began to ebb. What is missing is just as important as what remains. There is no clear empire marching in through burnt gates, no universal destruction horizon, no final inscription declaring defeat. The script of the Indus civilization still resists understanding, and without that key, its inner voice stays just beyond reach. We can map its decline, but not hear how its people explained it to themselves. Perhaps rivers shifted, perhaps trade routes weakened, perhaps new populations entered the subcontinent and altered the balance of life across the region. Perhaps all of these pressures worked together, slowly enough that adaptation felt possible until the larger structure no longer held. The people did not vanish. Their descendants remained part of the human fabric of South Asia. But the urban logic, the shared language of weights, bricks, planning, and signs receded. That may be one of the strangest endings in history. Not death, but dispersal. Not obliteration, but transformation so thorough that a civilization's physical intelligence survives more clearly than its words. And in that silence, the streets of the Indus still seem to ask whether continuity of people is the same thing as continuity of memory. What if the most decisive force in history is not destruction, but replacement? By the time we step back from these scattered worlds, a pattern begins to emerge with unsettling clarity. Again and again, ancient societies met stronger or more centralized systems at moments of vulnerability. Sometimes the pressure came from empires with armies and tribute demands. Sometimes it arrived through merchants, administrators, settlers, or new trade routes that slowly redirected power. In some places there was violence, yes, burned cities, broken walls, but in many of these stories the deeper loss came later, after the smoke had cleared or without smoke at all. A name disappears from the archive. A script stops being taught to children. A local god survives, but under another title. An elite learns a new language in order to remain important. A port continues to function, but now for someone else's empire. A capital is restored, yet no longer belongs to the people who first imagined it. This is the quieter machinery of erasure, not always dramatic enough for legend, but often more final. Because once identity is absorbed into larger systems, the transition can begin to look natural, inevitable even. The people remain in the fields, in the markets, in the bloodlines of future generations. But the frame that once told them who they were begins to dissolve. Within a century or two, memory itself loses its edges. That may be why so many of these vanished civilizations feel unnervingly familiar. Their endings resemble things human beings still live through: language shift, migration, bureaucratic incorporation, economic dependency, the seduction of belonging to a more powerful order. History is not always written by the victors because the victors are louder. Sometimes it is written by them because they become the system through which every later memory must pass. And so the ruins ask a harder question than who conquered whom. They ask how a people can survive physically and still lose the story that once made them legible to themselves. Perhaps disappearance is not the opposite of survival. Perhaps in history, the two have often walked side by side. What, then, do we owe the dead? Not certainty. History rarely grants that. What we owe them is attention, because behind every vanished civilization is a human scale that ruins alone cannot hold. Someone carried water through Petra before dawn. Someone painted a wall in Crete knowing light would strike it in the afternoon. Someone in an Etruscan city set a table for a feast, never imagining their language would one day survive only in fragments. Someone in an Indus town pressed a seal into clay as part of an ordinary transaction, unaware that future centuries would study the object and still fail to read the sign. These were not abstractions called cultures. They were people living inside a world that felt stable until it did not. That is why the silence matters, not because mystery is dramatic, but because it reminds us how fragile meaning can be. We are often taught to think of civilization as something material: walls, roads, archives, monuments. Yet those things are only containers. The real substance of a civilization lives in shared memory, in language, in the habits that tell one generation how to understand the last. Once those threads fray, survival becomes harder to recognize. And still, traces endure. A place name, a burial custom, a borrowed ritual, a construction method carried into a younger empire. a genetic line continuing quietly through time. Human history is full of these half-presences, these inheritances without acknowledgement. The lost are not always gone. Sometimes they remain everywhere, but no longer under their own name. Perhaps that is what makes ancient disappearance feel so close to us. It is not only about the past, it is about the possibility that memory itself can be reorganized, absorbed, translated into forms that leave the original voice just out of reach. And if that is true, then to study vanished peoples is not merely to recover old facts. It is to ask how much of any world can disappear before those living inside it understand what is happening. The question waits with us now as patiently as stone. In the end, these lost civilizations leave us with a truth that feels both ancient and immediate. The disappearance of a people is not always a spectacle. More often, it is a dimming. The sea peoples arrive in history like a storm and then dissolve into uncertainty. The Minoans leave behind color, architecture, and myth, but not a readable voice of their own. The Hattians lend their name to a land that outlives them. The Philistines remain visible in the records of others until even the label begins to vanish. The Nabataeans carve magnificence into stone, only to be absorbed into imperial order. Sardinia's towers outlast the social world that raised them. Elam survives conquest, then disappears inside administrative success. The Oxus cities stand in the desert with no final testimony. The Etruscans help shape Rome, then fade beneath its story. The Indus world disperses without a final scene, leaving behind systems of astonishing intelligence and a script still closed to us. Taken together, these histories ask us to reconsider what loss really looks like. A civilization can endure in architecture and vanish in language. It can survive in bloodline and disappear in memory. It can be admired, absorbed, inherited, and still be gone. The archive may continue. The city may remain occupied. The descendants may still walk the same ground. Yet a distinct way of seeing the world can pass beyond recovery all the same. That recognition should make us humbler. Every society believes in some quiet way that its meanings will carry forward intact. But history suggests otherwise. Memory is fragile. Identity is porous. Even greatness offers no immunity against being translated into someone else's narrative. And maybe that is why these vanished peoples still matter so deeply. They remind us that history is not only about what endures, but about what is quietly overwritten. They ask us to listen for absence, to notice the human worlds hidden beneath familiar empires, and to understand that silence is not emptiness. It is often the shape left behind when memory moves on. So perhaps the final question is not where these civilizations went. Perhaps it is this: how many voices, including our own, survive only as long as someone remembers how to hear them?